This Saturday at noon Eastern Time, 11 a.m. local time in the Central Time Zone, we have the second-ranked 8-1, 5-1 in Big Ten play Ohio State Buckeyes traveling to Chicago, Illinois to play at Wrigley Field against the 4-5, 2-4 in Big Ten play Northwestern Wildcats. Again, this game is taking place at noon Eastern Time, 11 a.m. local time in the Central Time Zone, and it will be streamed on the Big Ten Network. Ohio State opened up as a 30-point favorite in what is going to be termed as a neutral site game, but really it's a home game for Northwestern. Opened up as a 30-point favorite. The line is down to Ohio State minus 28.5, and the Buckeyes are given a 95.3% chance to win this game, according to ESPN's FPI. The last time these two teams met was 2022, when Pat Fitzgerald was Northwestern's head coach, when C.J. Stroud was Ohio State's quarterback. This is when Kevin Wilson was still on the staff for Ohio State. Jim Knowles was in his first year. So there's a lot that's changed even in the short period of time from the last matchup between the Buckeyes and the Wildcats until now. Ohio State, if you remember, won that game 21-7. It was a game that in the preview leading up to that game, the week leading up, profiled as a blowout. It was a scrappy contest. It was a game for really the entire four quarters before Ohio State finally pulled away due to their superior talent and utilizing C.J. Stroud's legs. This is a game where Ohio State should get up big. They should be able to rest their starters who've taken a ton of snaps in the month of October. You want to keep them rested for Indiana, healthy for that game, healthy for Michigan, healthy for the Big Ten championship game in the college football playoffs, which with the win over Penn State, barring a disaster, Ohio State's a lock to reach. That's your goal if you're the Buckeyes. Get up big, rest, experiment, try and plug new holes, get your young players experience, because especially on the offensive line, and I'd say at parts on the defensive line, you're going to need experience depth in the playoffs and in the assumed rematch against Oregon if Indiana is going to be a win for Ohio State. But for Northwestern's tougher than Purdue. And they're kind of playing host here. And they have a good defense. Purdue does not have any good part of their football team. Northwestern at least has a scrappy defense. And they do have a mobile QB. A QB who's proven to be better than anything Purdue has. So can they make this game close? As for Ohio State, how do they look in what can be, I think, a look-ahead spot? That's what we're going to be talking about here on College Football with Sam. I'm going to preview this game and obviously give my prediction. But before we do that, I ask if you can subscribe to the channel so that we can get closer to 30,000 subscribers. We will be doing a giveaway at the end of the regular season. So you also want to hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when that giveaway occurs so you can participate in it. And also so that you can get notified when I release college football content daily. We release college football content here nearly every day on College Football with Sam. We try our best to. And there's tons of preview and prediction videos. There's tons of Big Ten football content, some non-Big Ten football content as well. We are the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube. And thanks to you, we are becoming the best college football channel on YouTube. Your support means a lot. So hit that like button to get us into the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell. Share this video around to others who are looking for college football content to follow. They will love this channel. Comment your preview and prediction for this game down below. What do you want to see in this matchup? And also, check out our Discord server where we talk college football 24/7, whether you're an Ohio State fan or a Northwestern fan, a Big Ten football fan, or a college football fan. You will love this Discord server. And if you want to support the channel monetarily, there are links to my Patreon page and to my merchandise store where you can make purchases via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. That's also where the Discord server is. Again, really join that Discord server. It's totally worth it. It's free. The link to that is in the description and down below in the pinned comment, just like the Patreon page and merchandise store. Thank you very much, and let's dive in right here. So, the Buckeyes, this is a preview video that's very similar to last week's Buckeye preview and prediction video, talking about Ohio State versus Purdue. Northwestern is not as bad of a football team as Purdue. My potential power ratings would favor Northwestern to beat Purdue on a neutral field by 2 scores, potentially more. So that should give you an idea for how bad Purdue football is. And Purdue per FPI and S&P Plus is also viewed as anywhere from a score to maybe close to 2 scores worse neutral field. After all, Northwestern traveled to Ross-Ade Stadium, and I think they may have been banged up, and they beat Purdue. So right there, head-to-head victory on the road, I think that and how the game evolved and how it turned out proves that Northwestern is better than Purdue. But Ohio State's still viewed as widely better by a huge margin. They're viewed as 25.9 points better than the average college football team in FPI, 29.7 points better than the average college football team in S&P Plus, 24.6 points better than the average college football team per my potential power ratings. Northwestern, meanwhile, is 2.6 worse than the average college football team in FPI, 4 points worse than the average college football team per S&P Plus, and 7.4 points worse than the average college football team per my potential power index. So you take into account that this is technically Northwestern is the home team here playing host, but Ohio State fans are probably going to outnumber Northwestern fans here. I wouldn't even take home field into account, really, in this matchup as a result. Ohio State will be favored to beat Northwestern by about 28.5 points per FPI. So 28, 29 points. You look at S&P Plus, well, that number increases to about 33.5, 33.7 to be exact, points in favor of Ohio State. And then the potential power index thinks that Ohio State should be favored by 32 points here. So the Buckeyes are much better. This game should be a blowout in favor of Ohio State, even if they don't play to their A-plus level game. But as college football has shown this year, if a smaller team plays a good game, they're able to run the ball and limit possessions, it's a lot harder for the bigger team, the better team, the more athletic team, to negate that than it was prior to the change in the clock rules. So, of course, it's something to obviously keep in mind. I don't think the college football world is fully adapted to the new clock rules. That's why you're seeing Kentucky beating Ole Miss, for example, or how they played Georgia so competitively, how South Carolina played Alabama competitively, though that was a little more of an even matchup than we thought at the time. And also how Nebraska played Ohio State very competitively was also that same type of strategy that these smaller teams use to keep it competitive with these elite or near elite teams. But Ohio State here, they should pull away, and it should be fairly similar to what we saw against Purdue this past weekend. And you also see this in Ohio State's points per play margin, their expected points added margin, where they're both above 0.3 in each. Northwestern's in the negatives in both points per play margin and expected points added margin. Not quite as bad as Purdue, but not good. Not good whatsoever. Ohio State in points per play margin, they're second. They're only behind Notre Dame, and Notre Dame has not played a strength of schedule even close to Ohio State's caliber. They have a 0.414 points per play margin. The only teams to have a points per play margin this late in the season over the past 3 years were 2021 Georgia, 2022 Ohio State, and 2023 Michigan. That was of last week, where Ohio State was just below 0.4, Indiana was just above 0.4. They kind of flipped after their results. Now, points per play margin, of course, doesn't directly tell you who's going to win it all, but ever since 2020, the number one team in the country in points per play margin has won the national championship. So it's something to pay attention to. Ohio State's very high in that category. On a play-by-play basis, they dominate their opponents. They move the ball effectively down the field. That's why they're high in expected points added margin, because they also prevent their opponents from marching down the field consistently. Northwestern, meanwhile, on an average basis, you see that negative 0.044 points per play margin. On an average basis, they lose the play-by-play battle, and they don't move the ball down the field that effectively. They're very inconsistent on offense, and their defense, while good, it's not great, and it's not an elite defense either. And then you look at the strength of schedules here, there's a disparity. Northwestern's only played the 62nd toughest strength of schedule. Ohio State's played the 26th best. Ohio State's second in game control, which means only one team would perform better with Ohio State's schedule than the Buckeyes would, and that team per ESPN is Ole Miss. And Northwestern's 70th in game control. So these teams are quite different. It's not quite the mismatch that Ohio State and Purdue was, but it's close. It's a much more distant matchup than Ohio State versus Nebraska even, or certainly Ohio State versus Penn State or Ohio State versus Oregon. The critical matchup here, this is the path for Northwestern to play this competitively, to potentially pull off what would be an epic upset. But more realistically, this is also a test for Ohio State and to see what they can do. And the critical matchup is Ohio State's rushing offense, which is quarterback, running back, offensive line, maybe even some tight end, against Northwestern's defense. That's the test here. Ohio State, ever since Simmons has gone down, the only way they've been able to successfully run the football is using their athletic advantage, which is typically going to the outside, or heavily using misdirection. It's been mostly scheme. You look at the O-line and how it performs on a power-to-power basis, there are still causes for concern. So, how do they do in this game against Northwestern's defense? And again, this is a smaller matchup. Ohio State, I think it's been shown under day before, and especially this year, they get up for the big games. It's very clear. Against Purdue, it kind of felt like they were playing bored. It felt similar against Nebraska to a certain degree, even though there were legitimate concerns. But this is one of college football's best teams. I have them ranked second in my personal power ratings, like my eye test power ratings. And I have them at number 2 also in my potential power ratings, only behind Oregon in both. I mean, this is one of college football's best teams. You look at their rushing offense for Ohio State, and they've imploded. Earlier in the season, they had a top 5 rushing offense. Now, they're 19th in yards per carry, averaging 5.3. Now, that's good. That's great. But when you watch what they do, and this has, I think, been the case ever since Oregon, Henderson gets them big runs, and that pushes up their average to more than what it feels like. It felt like, for that Penn State game, outside of the speed options, and outside of that final drive, they weren't getting much. Against Nebraska, they didn't get anything. Against Oregon, outside of Henderson's 2 runs that were longer than 20 yards, they didn't get anything. And it's been similar. It was similar against Purdue. They were rushing for under 3 yards per carry and certainly under 4 yards per carry for most of that game until the end, when Henderson was popping off long runs and James Peoples was getting some good runs as well. This has not been a good rushing offense. It hasn't. There is a positive bias towards this Ohio State rushing offense because of what they did against weaker opponents earlier, because of what they did before Josh Simmons got out with his injury. And let's all be praying for Josh Simmons. Injuries suck. He's a talented man, and I hope that I don't know if he has eligibility or not, but I hope that his future serves him well, and I hope that he is blessed in his life. Injuries suck. We should never wish injuries on anyone in college football. Never. Ohio State only runs the ball for about 35.1 attempts per game, though, which is 83rd. I think that the staff is conscious of the fact that you have to run the ball to win big games, especially in the Big Ten, but you can't force the issue. Ohio State is not 2021, 2022, or 2023 Michigan. They are not Dan Lanning's Oregon. They are not even Penn State of 2022 when it comes to their ground attack, or Penn State of this year. They're not built that way. And that is both a curse, but it's also a blessing because they have way better receivers than any of those teams do outside of maybe Oregon this season and last season. And Will Howard's a criminally underrated quarterback. So I'm saying this all to say that it's something to pay attention to, because what would really make Ohio State's team complete, what would ensure that they can win it all, and I think they can, but we don't know, what can kind of seal the deal is if their rushing offense can find a way to become more consistent. So, something to pay attention to there. Looking at Northwestern's defense, and by the way, one more thing on Ohio State before we briefly talk about that. Travion Henderson should be the starting running back. Judkins against Purdue, against Nebraska, and against Oregon has averaged under 3 yards per carry. And the reason he averaged more than that against Penn State for the most part is how they used him on speed options, where Tom Allen was in man coverage, Ohio State was heavy to one side, and they just speed optioned to the side where Penn State had no one to tackle him. So, point being, I think Henderson's the better back. I think both have not been elite power backs this year, which for Henderson wasn't a surprise. I've actually been a little bit impressed by his power. For Judkins, it was surprising for some, but I think the fact that Big Ten defenses have been better than the SEC defenses that Judkins has faced didn't really surprise me all that much. I think Henderson's the feature back at this point. Both should be mixed in to keep them fresh. I like what Carlos Lachlan and Day and Kelly are doing there, but I think that Henderson's the guy at this point in running back, especially with the injuries on the offensive line, because we saw him last year when the O-line wasn't good. He'd make something out of nothing. Just get a little bit of space and he's gone. He helps this Ohio State offense more than Judkins does, just an opinion of mine. But getting into Northwestern's defense here, Ohio State is top 5 in almost every scoring defense category outside of opponent points per field goal attempt, and even then Ohio State's top 25. Northwestern only allows opponents to score 23.8 points per game, which is 50th, and average 0.336 points per play, which is 41st. Again, not a great defense, but Northwestern's outside of the top 110 in points per play and points per game on offense, so the defense doesn't have that much to work with. You look at the rushing defenses here, Northwestern's only allowing opponents to average 3.5 yards per carry, 24th. They're only allowing opponents to average 116.8 yards per game, which is 23rd. And teams are running on them quite a bit more than they run in Ohio State. Teams run in Ohio State for about 32.4 rushing attempts per game. Teams run on Northwestern for about 33.3. Now, the Buckeyes are averaging 3 yards per carry allowed, which is 8th. 95.8 opponent rushing yards per game, which is 5th. Obviously better than Northwestern in those categories. But Northwestern has a top 25 rushing defense. Have not played an uber tough strength of schedule. They have not. But they have played Wisconsin. They have played Iowa. They've played Maryland. They've played Indiana. They've played Purdue. All of those teams, yes, even Purdue, have anywhere from good running backs to elite running backs. They also played Washington earlier in the season too. Every Big Ten opponent they've played has at least a pulse on the ground. And Iowa, elite there. Wisconsin was churning on the ground for a while with Tawi Walker in that early to mid-October range. Washington has Jonah Coleman. Purdue's only bright spot on offense is their occasional ability to run the football for 10 to 15 yards per certain carries. And they've done well. So that's something to take away from all of this, is their rushing defense is good. Their passing defense, teams love to pass on Northwestern. It makes sense. They're outside the top 120 in both opponent pass attempts and completions per game. They allow opponents to average 7 yards per pass attempt, which is 55th, compared to Ohio State's 6.1, which is 23rd. And they allow opponents to average 11.3 yards per completion, which is 41st. Ohio State is elite at keeping opponents in front of their defense. They only allow opponents to average 9.9 yards per completion, which is 9th. Pretty impressive numbers from the Buckeyes there. Looking at these offenses, Ohio State's better at everything. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone who follows college football closely and who follows this channel. They're better at quarterback. They're better at running back, wide receiver. Tight end is probably the area where they are the closest, but I would still take Ohio State there, and Ohio State's better on the offensive line. The Buckeyes are far and away the better team here, not just overall. Even on defense they are, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, but on offense too. Will Howard leads the team with 2,237 passing yards. He completes 74% of his throws, 22 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, a 182.5 passer rating, and he is top 10 in QBR with an 83.6 quarterback efficiency rating. He is 7th right now. His best game of the season, when you adjust for opponent, was against Oregon, easily. 94.7 quarterback efficiency rating, 177.1 passer rating against who is the number one team in football right now. Will Howard's great. In fact, I'm going to even say he might be near elite. Elite, I'm not going to say that right now. No. And the reason I'm talking about that is because he has a better pass blocking offensive line than McCord did last year. And he has the best running back room that Ohio State has had easily since, 2019 in terms of top end talent. The receivers, I think, right now are better than they are last year in terms of balance. I still think that Marvin Harrison Jr. is a little bit better than Jeremiah Smith so far. I could be wrong at that. I think Smith's even more alien-like, which is insanely impressive. But Marvin Harrison was more consistent. Always showed up and popped off in big games. Jeremiah Smith shows up too and pops off. But does it even matter what I'm saying here? They're both elite wide receivers collegiately. Marvin Harrison Jr. is an elite wide receiver in the NFL, and Jeremiah Smith will be too. The point that I'm trying to make is more so the fact that Emeka Egbuka is healthy. Like, this Ohio State offense is better than the Ohio State offense of last season. And Will Howard has one of the best supporting casts in the country, especially when you factor in Chip Kelly, who, in big games, has been a good play caller. Emphasis on that big game part. We all remember the Nebraska game and how dull that was. So, this is a team that shows up when it matters most. They have a veteran quarterback who's great, near elite. An offensive line that I'd say is great to near elite, at worst above average or good in pass block, can be inconsistent, but they're still much stronger in pass block even after the Simmons injury than they are in run blocking, where I think on the inside in particular, it's kind of mediocre, down to down. On the receiving end of things, they're as almost as perfect as you can get outside of tight end. Quinshon Judkins still leads the team in rushing yards with 647. Travion Henderson is 588. Judkins is averaging 6.1 yards per carry with 6 rushing touchdowns. Henderson's averaging 7.5 yards per carry with 5 rushing touchdowns. Will Howard is 6 rushing touchdowns, averaging 2 yards per carry, 122 rushing yards. I don't know how to put this with his ground threat. He's been, it's what I said earlier, shows up when it matters most, like against Penn State, for example. It's weird. This is a strange Ohio State team. It has a feeling of last year's, but different, where again, Ohio State last season, like statistically, they weren't as good as the 2022 team for much of the regular season, but with the defense they had and with how they beat Notre Dame and how they were able to fight Penn State off and how they played against Michigan, it felt like they were better in the big moments. I hope I'm making sense when I say that. But you look at the receiving end of things, and they show up no matter what. Jeremiah Smith leads the team in receiving yards with 765, 9 receiving touchdowns. I had him as a top 10 wide receiver entering this season, an All-American wide receiver. I had no clue that he would be better than Emeka Egbuka. I didn't think that was going to happen with a healthy Egbuka. But that's the case right now. He's the best receiver on Ohio State. He's probably the nation's best wide receiver as a true freshman. Egbuka has 587 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns. Carnell Tate has 405 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. It's been nice to see him come into the fold as the year progresses. Innis had a receiving touchdown against Penn State, and he has 142 receiving yards on the season. G. Scott Jr. leads the tight end room in receiving yards with 104, and he also has 2 receiving touchdowns. So that's the Ohio State side of things. The Northwestern side of things, I'm going to keep it more brief offensively. Jack Lausch is their quarterback with 1,120 passing yards, 5 touchdowns, 4 picks, 5.8 yards per attempt. His QBR is pretty much in the tank. It's 107th nationally, 39.4 quarterback efficiency rating. Joseph Hyman II, Cam Porter, and Jack Lausch are the only players with over 200 rushing yards. Cam Porter is 6 rushing touchdowns and averages 4 yards per carry with 387 rushing yards. On the receiving end of things, A.J. Henning and Bryce Kurtz each have over 400 receiving yards. Henning has 3 receiving touchdowns, where he leads the team by a mile in that category. He also leads the team in receptions with 40. Thomas Gordon leads the tight end in receiving yards with 183, and he has 18 receptions. Cam Porter also has 18 receptions and 127 receiving yards. Final thing for offense, Northwestern's allowed 12 sacks on the season. Ohio State has allowed 11, but really only 9 because the sacks that Devin Brown takes don't really count since He's the backup. They don't put him in unless they're up big, and there's no way they can lose the football game. So really, it's 12-9 right there. You look at the pass blocking for these teams in greater detail for their passing offenses, and Northwestern has a 4.4 sack percentage, which is 36th. Ohio State is a 4.04 sack percentage, which is 30th. Ohio State has been dipping in sack percentage, which is expected given how they've been playing longer and longer without Simmons, and they're still figuring things out, I think, on the offensive line. It was impressive what they did against Penn State. I think it threw Penn State off a bit early, especially with the game plan they brought in the scripted drives. But Penn State, I think, did a pretty good job they did a very good job of adjusting in that second half defensively. It's just they couldn't overcome Ohio State's second half adjustments and the lead that they had. Northwestern's only averaging 5.6 yards per pass attempt and 10.5 yards per completion, both outside the top 120. Ohio State's averaging 9.3 yards per pass attempt, 6th, but only 13.1 yards per completion, which is 34th. That's because they're having a high completion percentage, and they do a very good job of always picking up the first down in the passing attack, but they've been a little bit inconsistent with the deep balls, and I think that's mainly because of Will Howard. It's not Carnell Tate, it's not Emeka Egbuka, certainly not Jeremiah Smith, who's almost always open. It's just whether or not you see him or not. And then on the rushing offense side of things, we already talked about Ohio State, but Northwestern's only averaging 3.4 yards per carry so far this season. So clearly Ohio State's better on offense. Defensively, it's also clearly the fact that the Buckeyes are better. And you look at Ohio State's defensive front, Jack Sawyer, Caden Curry, Kenyatta Jackson Jr., JT Tuimoloau at end, and Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams, Caden McDonald, and Hiro Kanu on the interior at defensive tackle. It is a defensive line that does not have a Chase Young, does not have a Bosa brother, outside of maybe Tyleik Williams, who's, I think, their best defensive lineman. They don't have the same NFL upside, I think, on that D-line that Michigan or maybe Penn State or a Tennessee or like a Texas of last year, or maybe even a Texas of this year. Their D-line is very good, does. But they have a lot of great collegiate players. They have some NFL players like their starting four, Sawyer, Hamilton, Williams, and Tuimoloau. And Jim Knowles' defense is one of the nation's best, if not the nation's best, when he just keeps things in front of him. I often, whenever watching Ohio State football games, get frustrated whenever they blitz, because the narrative is they need to blitz, they need to get more pressure. Well, what if I told you that against Oregon, when they blitzed or when they tried to do like one of those weird blitzes where it looks like they're sending everyone, but then they pull back to confuse the offensive line, whatever that's called. What if I told you whenever they tried to send pressure, they always allowed a big play? It happened against Penn State on the play before Igbinosun made that insane end zone interception, which was awesome. Jim Knowles sent a blitz. And consequentially, Penn State's Harrison Wallace III torched Davison Igbinosun because he had no help whatsoever. The Buckeyes, I think it's similar in a sense to Michigan. Just send four, keep your defense in front of you. It's how things are, I think, in the modern world of college football. Like, of course, you don't want to be generic, you don't want to be vanilla all the time, but Jim Knowles' defenses are the best when they limit big plays and just let you move in between the 20s. That is when they are at their best, because they're so talented and so good that a lot of teams will not even move in between the 20s on them when they're just vanilla and when they're basic and they do nothing and kind of wait for you to do whatever. I mean, their pass rush already is better than it was last year, and that's when they just simply send four. Trust me. I watched them against Iowa. I watched them against Nebraska. I even watched them against Penn State. So they've been blitzing a lot more recently, and by a lot I just mean more than previous games. The whole point I'm trying to make is this is a defense that is really good at linebacker. They got Sonny Styles, and Cody Simon's been one of their best players at linebacker. Denzel Burke and Davison Igbinosun, Their cornerback room is probably their weakest link on defense. Igbinosun is heavily penalized, way too aggressive for his own good. Burke has gotten burned at least at some point in every game outside of the Penn State game since the Oregon matchup. Ransom and Downs, I think, are the strength of the defense at safety. Always working, rarely mess up assignments, rarely get burned, and Hancock has been the best corner, though he technically plays nickelback in Jim Knowles' defense. That's really what Ohio State's defense is. It is a unit that can be aggressive, and sometimes you have to be, but it's best, it's very conservative. It just keeps you in front. You never get behind them. You never out-scheme them. It's just kind of waiting for the inevitable. Like, when are they going to strike? And it's typically when you enter their 50. Then that's when they strike. That's Jim Knowles' defenses at their best. And if I'm telling you, they're not going to get away with blitzing against Oregon. That's not going to happen. They actually did blitz against Oregon. As the game progressed, they blitzed more, and it did not help. In fact, it continued the bleeding. That 3rd and 5 where Oregon had that toss that converted the 3rd down, that was a 5 or 6 man pressure, and Oregon worked it because all of them went on the inside. It was the same thing with when they only sent 2 guys. That was a blitz that was meant to confuse the offensive line so that 2 would get home, and then if Gabriel scrambled out, he'd have a few guys waiting for him to ensure that all the short routes were occupied, and Gabriel's scrambling wouldn't work. But he didn't get home because Oregon's O-line's that good, and their elite receivers made the secondary pay. So just a little bit of my opinion there. But this is an elite defense regardless of what they do, because they've been blitzing more, and they're still one of the better defenses in all of college football. You look at Northwestern, we already talked about their defense, allowing 0.336, bless me, points per play, which is 41st. Ohio State's only allowing 0.176, which is 2nd. Ohio State's only allowing opponents to average 4.1 yards per play, which is 4th. Northwestern's allowing opponents to average 5.2 yards per play, which is 48th. The leader of these two teams, when you look at sacks for Ohio State, is J.T. Tuimoloau with 5. He has a pass defended and a forced fumble. Sawyer has 3 sacks. He has a forced fumble, 2 fumble recoveries, and a touchdown. And Cody Simon, Ty Hamilton, and Tyleik Williams each have 2.5 sacks. Ohio State has 26 sacks in total on the season. You look at Ohio State's pass defense, they have a 10.24 sack percentage, which is 7th. Now, opponents don't pass on Ohio State a whole lot. They're 7th in opponent pass attempts per game. Teams typically only attempt 25.3 pass attempts on them. That's because a lot of teams try and run the football on Ohio State, try to shorten the games. They have a better chance at victory. But Ohio State has been a lot more productive this season than last season at getting to the quarterback. Their leader in terms of tackles is Sonny Styles with 57, and Cody Simon follows him up with 49. For Northwestern, their leader in sacks right now is Aiden Hubbard with 4, and then Anto Saka and Michael Kilbane each have 2.5 as well. Northwestern has 7 interceptions, 38 passes defended, and 4 forced fumbles. Ohio State has 29 passes defended, 7 interceptions, and 8 forced fumbles. They've also done a better job at forcing turnovers this season, which might explain some of the bigger plays allowed in the secondary. Typically, when you try to force more turnovers, unless you have a generational defense, you do have that trade-off of the aggression biting you. But I don't know. Just a theory. Northwestern has a good defense. Ohio State has an elite defense. And I would take Ohio State's Sawyer, Jack Sawyer, Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams, J.T. Tuimoloau, Sonny Styles, Cody Simon, Denzel Burke, Lathan Ransom, Caleb Downs, Davison Igbinosun, Jordan Hancock. I take all of them over Northwestern's defense. Not a single Northwestern defender would start on this defense, in my opinion. Aiden Hubbard, R.J. Pearson, Carmine Baston, Jalen Pate, Mac Uhelane, Xander Mueller, Theron Johnson, Devin Turner, Coco Azema, Josh Fussell, and Braden Turner. I'd take Ohio State's defense there. I'd also take Ohio State in the trenches, obviously, over Northwestern. Better O-line, better D-line. I think Northwestern has the better special teams unit. They're ranked higher in ESPN's efficiency. And Ohio State, the bright spot of their special teams is exactly what it was last year. It's kicker Jaden Fielding, who's 6 of 7 on field goal attempts with a long of 46, and his only miss is from 40 yards or more. But Northwestern, their kicker on the year, Jack Olson, 7 of 10. Luke Akers is 6 of 9. They've attempted 19 field goals on the season. They're 0 from 50 plus. They're 5 of 7 from 40 to 49. 6 of 6 from 30 to 39. I would take Northwestern special teams, but not by all that much. As for coaching, I think Ohio State is the better coaching staff, both on offense, defense. They have the better strength and conditioning program. And Ryan Day, I made a Twitter post about this that I think I'm going to post in the comment section below if you want to read it. He may be the best coach in college football right now, and David Braun's still learning on the job. So, simply put, I think Ohio State is the better coach team. I think that Northwestern is going to cover here, not because Ohio State is going to be a bad team or they're going to have this atrocious game or because they're overrated or Northwestern's underrated. It's the simple fact that against Nebraska, they've been sluggish. Against Iowa, they were sluggish for a half. Against Purdue, they were sluggish. They were. And I anticipated that, but still picked them to win 59-0, and I was only off by 14 points. It was 45-0. I predicted the shutout because Purdue's that bad of a team. Northwestern is several touchdowns better than Purdue. And Ohio State, in the back of their mind, and I think the staff will manage this very well, but with some players, maybe even some staffers, they're thinking about Indiana, and they're thinking about the fact that Indiana's on a bye week right now. They have extra time to prepare for Ohio State and extra time to rest. Potential Power actually thinks that Ohio State's going to cover here. They're picking them to win by about 31 points. I'm going against that just a little bit, but I can see it going either way. I would stay away from a spread like this, especially since it's right before a big game for Ohio State. And I think that Northwestern is good enough to make a long field goal and probably get a garbage time touchdown late or maybe one early. And the minute Ohio State gets up by 4 touchdowns, they're going to want to mail it in. And think about it this way. Their backups, like backup quarterback, backup offensive line, they're not deep enough to where their backups can work a team like Northwestern for multiple touchdowns. They're not. Offensively, they aren't. Defensively, yes, they are, but the defense doesn't score touchdowns typically unless, they get a pick 6 or a fumble recovery for 6 like they did last week. So Ohio State wins 38-10. It'll be a fairly dominant 38-10. You'll know who's the way better team, but Northwestern will cover because the number's big. They'll want to score. They won't want to get shut out, and Ohio State will be a bit disinterested in this matchup. Thank you all so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Connor OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being all-conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Make sure to check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. I will see you all very soon. Go Wildcats and go Buckeyes.